In this video of Section 3 of Chapter 5 Supply, we are going to discuss different influences that affect the supply. So up to this point, we have reviewed what is supply, we've looked at some influences or some changes that can take place, and now we're focusing on what are the influences that really affect supply. So, first thing we'll look at is input costs. So from Section 2, we discussed some of the costs that go into producing a product, and now those factors can now play a huge factor in the amount of supply that is out there. For instance, rising costs. Let's say we have a rising cost of labor or raw materials. Then as a result, that affects the supply. So let's say we do have a rise in labor and materials. Let's say we are going to produce the bean bags, and all of a sudden, let's say we're using a leather material on the outside of the bean bag, and all of a sudden, now the cost of leather has tripled. Well, as a result of that, that's going to be a higher marginal cost. And as we looked at in Section 2, that means that it's going to cost more, produce more bean bags. So if this took place, we have a higher marginal cost. What would happen to the supply? And what would happen to the marginal revenue? Well, if it's a rising cost, that means the supply is going to decrease because we have less resources to work with, meaning we can buy less material, meaning we can produce less bean bags. And then that means the marginal revenue would have to increase, because that means our profit margin is going to start being eaten up as well. And we're in business to make profit, so if we're not making enough profit, well then as a result of that, we need to increase the prices. So it's going to affect the supply, the amount we have, and then the marginal revenue. Well, on the flip side, if we had technology, let's say that advanced, we were able to eliminate labor, or drop it by 50%, that technology is going to allow advancement, allowing us to produce more supply, and being able to affect the marginal revenue. We wouldn't have to change that at all. So input costs have a real big factor when it comes to the amount of supply and the marginal revenue that we have here. Now, if we look at this shift in the supply curve, which one would you say would we see an increase in the supply curve, and which one would you say we'd see a decrease in the supply curve? All right, so if you said for letter A, it would be technology, that would be correct. Technology would be a result in being able to produce more at a lower cost, and which would dramatically increase our supply. And then obviously letter B would then mean that we would see a decrease. If we have higher costs, that means we'd have a decrease in the amount. Whenever you see a shift in the supply curve, if it moves to the right, that means it's an increase. If it goes to the left, that means there's a decrease. All right, other things that can affect the supply. Government subsidies. So if the government is really trying to back certain types of industries, what it can do is it can provide a subsidy. And a subsidy is a government payment to support a business or market. In Chapter 4 on the test, it talked about E85 ethanol. And what we find here is that ethanol uses corn, and corn is used to feed livestock. Now, why would they get a subsidy? Well, not many people. If we were to take a survey of the class, we could ask how many of you drive a car, or your parents, or maybe even extended family drive a car that's E85. Probably not very many people. Well, since that is the case, as a result of that, that would result in less people being able to buy this subsidy or this ethanol, which means this industry would fail by itself because it cannot support itself. So what the government does sometimes, it provides subsidies or government payments that will provide support to an industry until eventually it's able to being able to support itself. And subsidies is not just a U.S. thing. They do this in other things as well. Indonesia, Malaysia actually have subsidies for a national car company. I've never even heard a car from either one of those countries, but it's more of a national pride type of thing. In France, they have subsidies for certain farmers to stay more traditional because the industry of tourism, people like to see that. Airlines, banks, we have subsidies here in the U.S. for farmers to pay farmers a certain amount. And the whole idea behind that is that we would always have enough supply of certain products or food products, which would result in making sure we'd have enough supply if we ever went to war. Now, as a result of that, if the market is only asking for a certain price, and what the market price is below what these farmers want, the government will come in and provide more money for that. So government subsidies, that's another thing that has a huge influence on supply. That was a positive. Now this is a negative part of that supply. Let's say there is a certain industry that the government is trying to prevent or hinder. So what they could do is put an excise tax on something. And that simply means is they put an extra tax on top of something else for whatever apparent reason they want. So cigarettes, alcohol, marijuana, luxury items. These are all things that are considered harmful or luxury. And if it's luxury, the whole idea is that the individuals purchasing this item, they can probably afford the tax already, so it's not a big deal. So again, if the government really wants to influence a certain industry that's harmful to public good, they can throw an extra tax on it to discourage people from being able to do that. There has been talk out there to throwing tax on individuals that eat unhealthy, or there's a global warming tax, tax the entire nation to try to prevent this, regardless of how we feel about it, or even just eating more healthy, trying to get people to eat healthy. So there's a way of doing that. Another way is just regulations, straight out laws that are out there. There is a video attached in Schoology that talks about this that I want you to look through. I want you to watch this little documentary that talks about New York City and Giant Sodas. It's a great video, does a great short little very entertaining about New York City and what took place with the ban on Giant Sodas. But they can have regulation on this. There has been regulation on the amount of rounds that handguns have in certain states too. So that has an effect on supply. If it's limited there or how much soda can be consumed, it has a huge impact on that. Henry Paulson said, former Secretary of State, excessive regulation slows innovation, imposes needless costs on investors, and stifles competitiveness and job creation. In a nutshell, what he's saying is that excessive regulation slows down innovation, and as a result of that, we're going to have less supply. So this regulation can really have a major impact in an industry that makes it difficult. As you know, I'm in the food industry. I have a food business, and all our equipment that we have has to be a commercial, and it has to have a blue sticker or a stamp on it called NSF. And as a result of that, that sticker increases the value of that kitchen equipment that we have, making it more expensive. And since it's more expensive, it's a lot more difficult to enter into this market, which means you need to have more investors, and then it's just more difficult to be able to adapt. So that regulation can really slow down things. What are some other changes? Well, then imports. Imports has a major part in this. Right now, we can get things from China really cheap. Also, things made in Mexico are cheap. At this point in time in U.S. history, there's been talk about throwing higher taxes on these other countries because their product is so cheap and it's not making it very competitive for U.S. countries to compete with some of these products that we're also producing. So those imports that are coming in can have a major impact on it. Future expectation of prices, just inflation in general. If we know it's going to increase in the future or decrease, that's going to have an impact on how much supply is going to be produced at that time. And then obviously the number of suppliers. The more people you have that are selling this, the lower the price, meaning less incentive for people to go out and produce products because there's not enough profit in it. So more suppliers, higher supply, lower supply, lower supply. Lower suppliers, lower supply. So it all works together. These are all influences that really can have an impact on this. And then even the position of where the product is being produced has an impact on that. So if we were to look at two companies, a tomato sauce company and a soft drink company, and let's say the tomato sauce company is part of a company that creates pizzas. Now, just a fun fact for you, the three top places on the planet or in the U.S. that consume the most pizza is New York City, Chicago, and those are no shockers there. And the third one is actually Alaska. Now, these tomato sauce companies that provide the tomato sauce for these pizzas have to make a decision on where they want to grow their tomatoes. Now, in this scenario, it's going to make more sense to find more fertile ground. And to find more fertile ground, that means it's going to probably have to be further away from the city. And if it's further away from the city, that means now there's a transportation piece that ties into this. So maybe the farms produce the tomatoes, and then the tomatoes then are transported to the factory that's in the city. So it makes more sense to transport it that way. But if we look at the other example here, it sometimes makes more sense to have the product located closer to the consumer. So maybe it's a soft drink, maybe it's a Pepsi. It's not going to make sense for them to be out in the middle of nowhere because what they need is more just warehouse setting, not actual agriculture property. So it's going to make more sense for them to produce a product that is closer to the consumer. So tomato sauce is an example of producing a product closer to the production facility out in the country. The other one makes sense to locate it to the consumer. So these are all influences that we find when we talk about supply. We have the input cost, which is the cost to produce the goods or services. Minimum wage can have an effect on that. Then we had government regulation and subsidies involved with this. We had imports and then just speculation about inflation. And then the amount of suppliers that are also involved with this. So these are all examples of different pieces of contributors that affect supply in Section 3 of Chapter 5 Supply.